I forget to do that. So we are recording. So I will be sharing my screen, but I'll pop in and out of sharing screen and then kind of coming back to view. So for those of you that do have, you know, your screens showing, and it's nice to see faces. So if you feel comfortable doing so, I encourage you to do that as well. So it is nice to see all of your faces. I thought we'd get started just for me to get a sense of who is in the room, the Zoom room. I'm gonna launch a couple of polls. One person. So I'm going to just kind of get a sense for who's here. I'm curious, the first question, what is your primary reason for attending this session? Is it to just stay up to date because you're curious about resume writing, you're currently unemployed, you're undergoing a career change or interested in a career change, or some other reason? So we'll take about a minute if everyone can respond. It is anonymous, by the way. And then for some of you, it might be both, like curious and also interested in career change as well. Okay. So looks like 84% have voted and 78%, let me just share the results so everyone can see. Okay, so primary reason for attending to stay up to date, that seems like the majority of you, 78%. There are some people, 7% currently unemployed, and then there are 15% that are interested in a career change. So thank you, because that really helps me understand a little bit more about the group dynamic. So thank you for that. And then the second thing I wanted to highlight here, the second question. Actually, I'll wait on the second question. We'll get started looking at the PowerPoint. So I'm gonna jump into share my screen. So everyone should be able to see my screen right now. I'm gonna leave it in this mode though, not fully in a presenter mode, just because that allows me to see the chat on the side and also your faces. So what I've included here, just so I don't forget, my name and my email address. You're welcome to follow up with me with questions. I will be real honest. If you want your resume reviewed more for an in-depth look, that can be a possibility, but it's likely that that will be probably more probable over the semester break. Right now, we're really inundated with the students. But I encourage you to reach out, and I'm happy to talk with you more about your own resume if you have questions or a specific question. But for a full critique, I would say during the break, if you are interested in that, we do have appointments for alumni that you can reach out to us, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have going forward. So please feel free to take down my email. This is our agenda for the next hour or so. I thought I would start out with how things have changed, and then particularly around that topic, recruitment strategies, because I think that that's one of the biggest changes that's happened. We'll talk about applicant tracking systems and artificial intelligence and how they affect a contemporary resume and what that might look like. And then I also wanted to throw in there the impact COVID has on just job search in general, but in particular, how you might use a resume. And then talking about how it is really more than just a resume. So we talked about contemporary resume writing strategies, but really, I think one of the biggest changes is that it's now more than just a resume. There's so much more to it. It's not just writing a resume. We'll also talk about what to include on a resume, what to leave off, so updates in that regard. And then also any special circumstances that might relate to anyone in the group, a career change or re-entry if you've been laid off, displaced, or terminated or fired. So if anyone has anything they want to share or specific questions that they want to ask as it relates to that. And sometimes it's not even definitely your own situation, but you're just curious, if this were to happen, what would I do? And so I'm happy to get into those questions as well. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of what we're gonna cover. So before we get started, I really wanted to, I was thinking a lot about this today, and I think this is important that I sort of give this disclaimer at the beginning. The resumes are subjective, and these are my opinions based on 20 plus years of experience and research with people from all different industries in all different stages of their career. And industry specific insight is so critical when you're writing a resume. I can't emphasize that enough, that there are a lot of nuances that are specific to particular industries and or organizations themselves. So the advice I might give you might be very contradictory to a particular industry and a specific company within that industry. They might say, well, I would do exactly the opposite. And I think that's why my biggest piece of advice is you have to do your homework and you have to understand what different companies might be looking for. So these are my opinions based on what I know. But of course, they are subjective, and there are going to be a lot of different opinions about them, which is why I think a lot of people struggle with it. The other piece of this is the advice and approach will change based on where you are in your career and the unique circumstances that you're in. So if you are if you've been in your career for 15 plus years, that advice and guidance I would give you on a resume is going to be very different than an entry-level professional within the first 1 to 2 years on the job. So keep that in mind too as we go through. And then I think, one of the things I say to every single client or student that I ever work with is that you have to be comfortable with this story your resume tells above all. And so I'll give you some guidance. I'll give you my experience and my opinion, but ultimately you need to feel comfortable with what is on that document in the story that it tells. And so I think above all, that last point is probably one of the most important things. Okay. All right. So the good news is some things have not changed in a number of years in terms of resume writing. Our resume is still critical to the job search process. In fact, I just saw my fellow colleague this morning from CN, she's a director there. She posted an article on LinkedIn, or a question more so on LinkedIn, and she said, is a resume still relevant? And there was a lot of commentary on that. And I think the answer is, yeah, it is absolutely still relevant, and it is still critical to the job search process. But I think, there's other elements that have become important as well that we have to pay attention to. But I think the good news is it's still relevant, it's still critical. And so a resume can still be a great tool to get your foot in the door with a lot of different organizations. The other thing that's changed is it should be tailored to the position you're applying for. That's always been the guidance. Maybe back when I first started about 20 years ago, it was more common to do a general resume where you might mass mail, like physically mail that out to different companies. But over the years, that message has shifted much more to, it should always be tailored to that position or to the industry that you're applying in. You still should always include relevant information. Reverse chronological is still the most common format, meaning your most recent experiences first. So there are other kinds of resumes, like functional resumes that focus on skills. And I still think that employers do prefer the reverse chronological over functional. Don't use a template and don't get too fancy. So there are some models or templates of resumes where you might see they have a photo and they have these really clever graphics and fancy text boxes. That might be appropriate for certain industries where you're trying to showcase a skill. So for example, if you're a graphic designer or there's some aesthetic element to your profession where illustrating that in a resume could be helpful. Generally speaking, don't get too fancy. Keep it conservative. Err on the side of being conservative is still a general rule of thumb of resume, general resume writing, and not using a template. So just using a Microsoft Word document, using a blank document. This advice for me has never changed. I do not like resume templates at all, and I would never encourage anyone to use them. I think they're very stifling, and they make you fill in categories that might not always be relevant for you. And so you want to use a document and create that document around your story, not you creating your story around that document. And so not using a template still has not changed. You still have to understand industry trends and use jargon and keywords. The reasoning behind that may have changed a little bit, but generally speaking, that has not changed. And then your resume still can give off red flags to employers. So, you know, things like if you have a lot of jobs very short term and you don't really explain why, that still can put off a red flag to employer. If you have large gaps in your employment history, that still can send a red flag to employers. So you have to be careful about the story that resume is telling to someone who doesn't know you. So those are just some of the general things that have not changed. Some of the things that have changed, it's interesting because I put contact information at the top because I was thinking in my head, you know, as you go down a resume, what looks different? And contact information is one of those things where it's really interesting to me because we've shifted from the old model of resumes that have your address on them, so your physical address. I now tell people, do not include your physical address on your resume. If you are interested in letting an employer know, for example, I live in Geneseo, New York, and I want a job in Livingston County, then it might benefit me to put Geneseo, New York on my resume underneath my name, phone number, and email, because then the employer can be local. But if I live in Geneseo and want a job in, you know, the greater New York area, that really doesn't benefit me necessarily to put that on there. The other reason to not include your whole address is for safety reasons. So a lot of times now we're not sending our resume to a particular human being. We're putting it on an open source, sometimes a job board, for example, which multiple people might have access to. You know, for safety purposes, I tell people there's really no reason now to put your physical address on there because, you know, employers don't snail mail anything anymore. There may be very few circumstances where this is relevant, and in some cases, your personal information on a resume, the only circumstance I can think of off the top of my head would be a federal resume if you're applying for a federal job. And in that case, your personal information would be much more relevant. And then you would include things like, this is a whole nother topic, but just to give you an example, you would include things like if you had veterans preference or if you are a US citizen, because there are certain jobs that you can only apply to, or you get preference points based on those things, and where your physical address would be a necessity. But for a general resume to most other jobs, your name, your email, and your phone number are really all that you need in that contact info. The other element of that that's changed is now you'll see most people use a LinkedIn URL in their contact info, because if you have a dynamic LinkedIn profile, that's where you can accentuate some of your experiences in a more creative way. And I'll show an example of that as we get to the end. For people who have digital skills and tech skills, this is a great place where you can include things like a website or a blog or, you know, other relevant information based on the industry you're looking for. So contact information is no longer just your physical address. That's changed quite a bit. I think one of the bigger trends is also this concept of differentiation. Getting away from just listing job duties, where it was used to be much more of, okay, this is what I did, and then putting it in the context of duties include, responsibilities responsible for. Now it's really turned into more of accomplishments. So what did you do? Why did you do it? And why was it relevant? So what were the outcomes with that? So I think the action verb statement piece of this takes a considerable amount of effort to think about not just what you did, but the impact that you had in that experience. You know, how do you differentiate yourself from other applicants who may have similar positions? Another change is the objective. Objective is a very dated trend on a resume. We encourage people to not include an objective. And then you might see in older formats of a resume, references available upon request at the bottom. It's pretty much expected now that you have references, so you can send those either in a job application, attaching them to the appropriate field in an application, or just a separate piece of paper where you're listing 3 to 5 professional references, but you don't have to put that sentence at the bottom that just says available upon request. It's pretty much assumed that you should have them ready to go when you're asked for those. Another change is that the job market has been changing so quickly. And really, I think we have millennials to thank for this trend. You know, a lot of people complain sometimes about the millennial, the me generation, they call them. But I like to look at them as they really redefined the working world, in that they change jobs more frequently. And so I think it's become more common that, and the work world has changed so fast that people are changing jobs more frequently. People aren't picking a job and staying with it for 25, 30, 40 years anymore. On average, people will change jobs between, every 3 to 4 years. And so because this transition is much more common, it's not as much of a red flag to employers to see multiple jobs listed on a resume. They're not looking necessarily for that really long career at one particular company or organization. So I think that's definitely a change. I touched on this, and we'll keep going back to this concept, but a resume is not the only way a recruiter or someone in your industry can learn who you are. The resume kind of is that formality in some cases where they can get to know you in terms of your accomplishments, but there's LinkedIn, there's social media. And I'll tell you that if you are a serious candidate for any position, or if any employer is interested in learning more about who you are, they are going to look you up on either LinkedIn or all of your social media that you might have available. And so the resume is kind of that official document. And then where LinkedIn can be such a wonderful supplement to personalize and be more creative and interactive in your profile. And if you do it in a way that's meaningful, so can things like Instagram, Twitter, other social media platforms you might use. They can also help your professional image too, if you know how to promote, certain things in a way that's beneficial to you. So, a resume is not the only way a recruiter can learn more about you. And then lastly, how and where you're sending it has definitely changed. So, I can't tell you the last time I had a student say, I want to print out copies of a resume. Or I had a private client I worked with that said, how many resumes should I print? That has changed. Not to say you never print a resume anymore, but in many cases, you're either emailing it, attaching it, forwarding it along, attaching it or putting it into an applicant tracking system, applying directly through a company website. So gone are the days of the snail mail resume. Okay, I shouldn't say they're obsolete, but they're definitely a little bit few and far between. So I want to make a little shift to talk about getting into the content now. So I think in order to write a resume, first and foremost, or to update your resume, first and foremost, you have to understand what are the skill sets of your industry that particular employers are seeking. And so I thought I would just put this up because these are the 2020 most sought after success skills that were rated by employers according to the Future of Jobs report from the World Economic Forum. So this list just came out. And if you're unsure, if you're making a career change and you're kind of thinking to yourself, I don't really know exactly what I'm looking for, so I have no idea how to update my resume. At the very least, you can think of it through the lens of some of these skills. How do I demonstrate when I've been creative? How do I demonstrate my people management skills? And some of these might seem hard, like how do you demonstrate emotional intelligence on a resume? So thinking about when have I done some of these things? Cognitive flexibility, this is interesting. I think adaptability and flexibility post-COVID is huge to all employers. You know, how can you continually pivot based on how rapidly things are changing? If you can demonstrate it on a resume, that's valuable to any industry. And so I just wanted to share these success skills, because this can help you as a starting point to think about how to maybe update your resume to more contemporary skill set versus maybe the last time that you've updated, because those skills definitely do change. The general strategy, hang on one second. Let's see if I can get to my other poll question. Okay, so I'm going to stop the sharing for 1 second. Before I go into my next thing, I want to go to my next poll question, which is, where are you currently in your career? So I'm curious where everyone is, because I'm going to give some general strategies based on this. So if everyone could take a second and enter in where they are. Okay. Okay, I'm going to end the polling. So it looks like almost everyone has completed. And I'm going to share the results with everyone so you can see it. So this is where our group stands. The majority are at that C-level, 15 plus years. We have 30% in the mid-career, 20% in the professional, and then we have 7% entry level. So for me, this is important because the advice that I will give based on resumes also too depends on where you are. And since we have a lot of seasoned professionals in here, I encourage you to share any insight that you have as well. So as we're talking through some things, if there's some things that stories, experiences, things you know about your industry that you think is helpful, I love those stories, and I think it's always more enjoyable when we hear more than just one perspective of my own. So here's my general strategy around those areas, and feel free to jump in, anyone. If you're entry level, 1 to 2 years in your resume, you still can lean into your academic experience. And what I mean by that is you can lean into things like projects you worked on in college. You know, you can lean into your clubs and organizations that you were a leader in or really highly involved in. You can lean into even related courses you might have taken that are directly related to a job you might apply for. Anything you did in college is really fair game to still include in a resume, because you might not have all the years of, you know, work experience, or even your internship that you did if you did an internship or research. So you can really lean into those, what I would call your education or academic experiences still. For professionals, 3 to 6 years in, this is when you start to trim back on that education section, and you're focusing more on those tangible related experiences, and including in your current positions, if those are related and or not related, any training or professional development that you've participated in to really gain more skills or knowledge in that particular industry. This is when you really focus on those tangible experiences. Even the jobs you've had, even if the first couple years you were, you know, working part-time, doing some freelance work, trying to get some experience, and you had to work a couple part-time jobs, you can still include those part-time experiences and focusing on those transferable skill sets. I think are very highly valued by employers, especially those that are very transferable to any industry. Also, to highlight any transitions and their relevance. So if you got a promotion, if you had, you know, maybe you didn't get the title promotion, but you had increased responsibilities, highlight that. Maybe you changed jobs a couple times in those 3 to 6 years, changing industries, you could highlight those types of things, okay? When you get to the mid-career, this is where I think you really shift to delivering clear examples of what you've accomplished. So, you know, just a couple questions that I think are good to ask yourself. Did I create new systems, new processes? Have I generated new business? Did I help launch something new? Did I help the company or organization save money and or make money? You know, maybe you're in a nonprofit and you're working in philanthropy. So quantifying information is helpful, but isn't always necessary. So you can tell, you know, an anecdotal story by using a couple action verb statements that talk about the impact you had without numbers, percents, and dollars. So I think in your mid-careers, when you really make that shift and you really get into those clear examples, you're moving away from sort of those transferable skills in many cases. With the exception is if you're going to change industries, and then you might have to really focus in on that. When you get up to sort of the 15 years plus, this is when I think my recommendation usually is to include the summary or highlights of qualifications. I was just meeting with someone a couple of days ago. We were talking about this, and she was interested in a completely different career shift, but she had been working in the field for quite some time, and she wasn't using a summary. And we talked about it, but she had experience working in a variety of industries with a variety of clients. A real breadth of experience across the board in, working specialty areas. And it was really hard to get that from reading all of her individual descriptions. And after she was able to do the summary of qualifications right at the top, it became much more clear right at the beginning when you read through that. It gave the resume some context. So if you have a lot of experience, this is when I would really encourage people to really spend some time thinking about that summary of qualifications, or some people call it highlights of qualifications, career summary. It's called different things, but I don't think it's appropriate for every single person to have on a resume. It would really depend on the situation, but definitely appropriate for someone with a lot of years of experience. I included an example on here, so just to give you an idea of what I mean. So this is one bullet point, and usually on a summary, I'm not big into telling people this is how many numbers of bullets you should have, but four is a good number. You could do 4 key bullets under a summary of qualifications that look at more thematically throughout your resume what I should expect to read. So those should be the high impact statements, and also use a lot of keywords in the industry that you're hoping to break into. So if you are using that resume in an applicant tracking system, they pick up the keywords that are essential to that particular industry and job. Okay. I wanted to talk about this a little bit more because there's a lot of you in this call who are the 15 plus years. Like I said, it can be a narrative, but I think it should be very concise. So for that reason, I tend to do more of a bullet point function with it, because less words to me on a resume is more. So if I can get rid of pronouns and transitions and things like that and go right into the meat of what I'm trying to say, that is what I usually do recommend. And that's why the bullet points are really helpful. And actually, applicant tracking systems read bullet points very, very well, as opposed to sometimes more of the contextual narrative type of writing. Sometimes what I've learned too with the summary, if it helps, because these always need to be updated, because as you get more experience, you might write the summary a little differently. I think it's best to try to write these after you have an updated resume. And the reason I say that is because it highlights all of your capabilities, which are supported by the specifics in your resume. So until you have those specifics down, it's really hard to think of those in broader strokes. So if you're writing this resume from scratch, say you haven't touched your resume in a number of years, which by the way is very common. I don't even like to touch mine, and I do it for a living. If you haven't touched it in a lot of years, I would recommend to update your entire resume first, do the best you can, and then go back to the summary and try to think about, if I were trying to tell someone my career story based on what is on this document right now, what are the things I might say that tell that part of the story more holistically than just getting into the nitty-gritty action verb statements. These are more of a thematic statement about your experience. And these are really hard to write. I think they take some time and some reflection. But here's some questions you can go back and ask yourself to help you write them. What is most valued in your target industry? And you have to put it in that language. What experiences, skills, and characteristics matter in your target jobs? Again, aligning your skills and your accomplishments with what you hope to achieve. And putting yourself in the hiring manager's shoes, I think, is always helpful. What would you look for if you were hiring someone? If you have 15 plus years experience, you've supervised people, you know what you're looking for. What would you look for in someone that you were going to hire for this position you're applying for? Put yourself in their shoes. What would you be looking for? And that can be real helpful when you think about it in that way. Any questions so far? I'm gonna stop the share for a second and check in with everybody. How we doing? You can pop something in the chat. You can unmute. Any thoughts? Everybody good? Okay, good. Little emojis are helpful too. Okay. Like I said, feel free to unmute and jump in if you do have some questions. Am I on point? Are people learning things? Is this good? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to jump back in then. Good. Great. I like these questions popping in. Are there specific resume formats that should be used? So that's a great question. The most common format is going to be reverse chronological. And I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty in a minute in terms of like what to include. But reverse chronological essentially means the most recent experiences first. You'll see sometimes people call them chronological, but really they're not chronological. It's chronological would start with the oldest and move forward. They're really reverse. So it's the most recent experiences first. And then someone said in here, when would you include an artisan or Etsy business? That's a great question. I have an example of this too with as far as freelance work too. If it's relevant to the position you're applying for, you can put it right up in the main work experience section as a business. And actually the gig economy is something that definitely has changed. So with people transitioning jobs more regularly, also too, it's more custom to see people working 4 different gigs at the same time than it was just one job at a time. So I'm not saying that's for everybody, but employers are used to seeing that. You might dabble in real estate. You might have a business on the side on Etsy. You might do some freelance work because web design and you're doing some freelance for 4 different organizations. So it's always relevant to include that if you're showcasing the right transferable skills. So it really depends on the industry you're trying to break into. If the industry is directly related, like I said, you could put that right under, related experience or work history. If it's more of a transferable type of skill, then I might include it under a section called additional experience. And then I would really focus on those transferable skill sets that would be most related to that industry you're trying to get into. So I'm going to show you some resume samples too, 3 different samples, one of the reverse chronological, one of a functional, and then also one of kind of like a designer type of resume where you're showcasing some of the creative skill sets. So I will definitely show you some examples in just a few more minutes. Good. Okay, so let's kind of jump into the next thing here. So what to actually include on your resume. So you have your work history. So that's, it could also be your education, your certifications, training, and professional development. You can also include non-work experience. So this would be any involvement in professional organizations, community service, or side projects. You can include skills. I lean toward the side of hard, tangible skill sets, like technology or digital skills and languages as an example, versus things like just listing out good communicator, great people skills, team builder. I'd rather see you demonstrate those capacities in your action verb statements, in your experiences, than just to kind of lay them out in a laundry list. I don't think that's as effective. I think pretty much anyone can kind of laundry list those soft skills, but it's giving it context that really makes the difference. You can also list out any awards, honors, research, or other areas of distinction. And then we talked about the summary or highlight section. So generally speaking, this is sort of the content of what you might find. The order really depends on, you know, I always call it, I don't know why this always sticks to me, but I call it the rule of 2 R's, recency and relevancy. Is it relevant to the job you're applying for, industry? And how recent is it? Because if you're going back 10 years to something and you haven't done anything at all in that huge time space, it might not be worth it to kind of draw attention to the fact you haven't done anything, you know. So if you haven't volunteered in 10 years, don't stretch it back 10 years because it just kind of highlights the fact you haven't done it in 10 years. If you're highlighting professional development or trainings you did eons ago that have expired or are not current or relevant, don't bother, get them off of there. Your resume should be succinct and never exceed 2 pages. For those of you with the 15+ years experience, if you're applying to a direct, you know, a job on application or, you know, through a company website or sending it out to someone in a network capacity, it should not exceed 2 pages. It should be the most relevant and recent information that you can put on that document that pertains to that job or industry. So generally, this is sort of that list that I would pull from. If you've been out of college for a considerable amount of time, then it's time to move that education to the bottom. Depending on when you graduated, you might even decide that you don't want to put the date of graduation in your degree, because then there's the option of ageism, discrimination in that way as well. You're better off to get the interview and then to win them over in the interview if you feel that ageism might be something you're concerned with. And it's real and it does happen. So if you've graduated from, you know, Geneseo or your graduate degree many, many years ago, more than 10, more than 15 years ago, you know, you can drop that graduation date right off. That's fine. You don't have to include that. And that would be more toward the bottom of your resume. And then your relevant work history would be really at the top, okay? As you're going through your work history, these are important questions. And when I say work history, it could be paid or unpaid. So kind of going back to the Etsy question, if you're asking yourself these questions and you say, what process did I implement to improve things? And you go to your Etsy business and say, oh, when I did this thing, I really improved my sales by, you know, exponentially. It doesn't matter where this fits in, if this freelance, if it's entrepreneurial, if it was paid, if it was service-based. If you're asking yourself these questions and that experience pops up on that agenda and you can demonstrate it through that experience, then you probably want to think about including that in some way on your resume if it gets at some of these questions, you know. But these are some of the probing questions that you can ask yourself to think about, you know, what have I done that is really more accomplishment based versus kind of just the general duties. So things you can go back through. So let's look at an example. This is an example of an associate accountant position. So when you're listing out your experiences, you're listing your position title, your company name, city, state, and then the dates in which you worked there. And then you're going to choose action verb statements that really identify accomplishments-based results, leading in with that action verb. Staying away from things like assisted or duties include or helped. You're really going into the actionable item. There's many lists that are out there. Even if you Google action verb statements for resumes, you'll come up with a ton of different lists that are really, really strong that you can be able to use. And you don't want to say everything you did at the job. You want to say only the things that are most pertinent and relevant to that particular industry and or new job you're applying for. This can be some of the hardest work, I think, when people think about updating the resume. I think this makes it really a challenge because we are attached to the work that we've done, those accomplishments and things that mean a lot to us in our work. They might have nothing to do with what we're applying for, but the fact that, we did it means a lot, and so we want to include it. But you have to really be as concise as possible. There's a lot of research that suggests when employers look at this the first round through, 6 to 10 seconds is a quick overview. So they're only going to pull out certain things. And as they move from position to position listed, it's very likely they're probably not going to read more than 4 to 6 lines before they move on to the next thing. And that's probably the second scan through if you make it through the first scan. So, and keeping in mind that most people read stuff now on their screens versus paper, and reading on a screen is very different than reading on paper. Me personally don't have the patience to read on a screen like I do on a paper, because on a paper I could, write, and I know I can take notes and things on a screen, but I just think it's generally more, it's harder to get through dense content on a screen. And so if you can really be intentional about what you include in those action verb statements and only include the things that are most relevant, I think that's probably the most, the best use of your space. Okay. So a couple other things, and then I'll show you some samples. The circumstances matter for, I know some people in here talk about that they are currently unemployed or wanting to make a career change. And I know that, some people in the group, there might be definitely some questions about if I were ever fired, furloughed, laid off. The circumstances definitely matter. For example, the difference between a layoff and a termination. So you don't need to include why you've left a job on your resume. So as you're trying to figure out what am I going to include, what am I not going to include, if you were fired, and there's a lot of different opinions on this, but this is my opinion. If you were fired and you were in that job for not a long period of time, my recommendation would be just don't include it. You're better to have that small gap on your resume than you are to try to explain away why you've been terminated from a position. If you were in a job for a really long time, years and years, and it's a related experience, and it's going to be important to be seen on your resume, you can absolutely include it, even if you were terminated. But you don't have to put any information about that in a resume or in a cover letter. You're better off trying to explain those circumstances more so in an interview in a very positive way. And what I put in that second to last bullet point is self-reflection and learning is key. What did you learn from that experience about yourself? And how has it made you a better potential applicant for this next job? I'm just gonna look at the chat real quick, so we got some questions. Go back 2 slides for a second. Okay, so this one, the questions to ask yourself, I'll leave that up. And by the way, I can send this, I'll send this to Michelle so that she can send this out to everyone, so you don't have to memorize everything. I'll send this whole thing to you so that you could, you can have that. Let's see what other questions. Should verbs be in past or present tense, or do they just need to be consistent? That's a really good question. If you're currently in the position, then they should be present tense. The only difference with that would be, they would be in the past tense if you're talking about just one thing you did one time and it's over. So if you improved a process, I think it was, let's see. Where did I go with this example here? The last one, see how I have everything in the present tense? I have manage and collaborate, and the last one I have streamlined, because that last one was a one-time thing. I streamlined invoicing guidelines and procedures and saved money. That's something I did, done, it's over, past tense. I'm currently still doing those other things, so it would be in the present tense. Okay, good question. Okay, so would you include LOA due to a medical issue in interview? So this I think is very specific depending on the situation. But to answer your question, like very surface, but I'm happy to talk about this offline if you want to reach out and we can talk about your specific situation, because there could be some nuances there that make me feel differently about this. But generally speaking, you want to try to, you always want to be genuine, and you always want to try your best to, you want to be as honest as possible. I really do believe that. It's not good to, hide things or, but at the same time, you want to give yourself the best possible chance to get to the interview and then get to the offer. Once you get to the offer, then they know, they like you and that they have, you are a top candidate. At that point is when you would be able to disclose any accommodations and or anything you would need based on that job offer. I tend to not be open about any accommodation needs right off the bat unless it's pertinent to you doing that job, because that can open up the door for a lot of discrimination to take place before they even get a chance to interview you and get to know you. As far as like a layoff or termination goes that is related to, it could be many different things, and people experience hardships in their life for a lot of different reasons. And the reality is employers don't need to know all the details, and nor do they want to know all the details. I honestly really believe that they don't really want to know all the intimate details of your past. But I think that you can be honest about, I was working for this particular company. I was having some extenuating circumstances that really were a hardship in my life. And for that reason, I was evaluated and my performance review came back under par. I was very stressed at the time, dealing with many different things. Since that time, I have really, things in my life have really turned around and continue to explain that. So in other words, you don't dwell on the past. You're not, I think the worst thing you can do in this case is to really get into how terrible your other employer was for whatever reason. They might have, justified laying you off or terminating you. You always just want to kind of focus on what you learned from that experience and how you move forward and how that knowledge will help you be a better worker in this future circumstance. So really positivity, self-reflection, what you've learned about yourself really are the key elements here. I think those individual questions really, like I said, if they're real specific to you based on a circumstance, I would feel better doing that in an individual coaching session to kind of coach you through how to answer that question based on the circumstance. But generally speaking, big picture overview, those are my thoughts about that. Okay, good questions. I just want to go back to a couple points about this. You can explain a layoff in a cover letter. So sometimes, because a layoff can happen for reasons that are out of your control. You can be a wonderful employee and get laid off. And if the layoff is in your current position, it makes sense to talk about that in a cover letter, because they might want to know why you're searching for a job at this particular time. So you can certainly talk about that in a cover letter. And there are pros and cons, like I said, to listing a termination, because, in some cases, if you've been fired from a job and you list it, they're going to ask you about it. What happened, why are you not there anymore? You're going to have to kind of talk about it. And if you don't list it, at some point in time, if it does come up, if they, for whatever reason found out you worked there at a later time, you run into that situation where they might ask you, well, why didn't you tell us that? So if it's maybe like a competitor or someone that's in that same industry, you might really want to weigh the pros and cons about including it or not, because they may find out at some point. So again, it's that very individual circumstance. COVID conundrums, if you are, I just had to throw this in there, if you are laid off or furloughed, or you find yourself underemployed, there are so many things you can do to add to your resume in the interim, gig work, so small small term opportunities, freelance opportunities, volunteerism. There's even courses you can take on LinkedIn just to kind of keep your skills set up. Attending conferences and trainings. Right now, I think in the virtual space, there's lots of virtual things you could take advantage of. Thinking about your professional brand, how do you, your LinkedIn profile, maybe you develop your own website, maybe you start a blog, things like that. And then there's a LinkedIn profile, and I'll share this with everyone, but this is a link to a profile that this particular person has a visual representation of his resume on there. So he has a traditional resume, normal, kind of like what we've been talking about, but then he used on LinkedIn, updating a PowerPoint, it's a video description of his skill sets and things. It's very clever and creative, and he has this out for people to see. And so I include the links so you please check it out, because you can do some pretty neat things on LinkedIn. And then for the person that asked about the Etsy question, or even like freelance on a resume, this is a way you could list that. So this person did marketing, and then they include one statement about completed multiple marketing related projects for a diverse range of companies, with particular emphasis on further developing social media outreach, etc. And then she listed underneath there all of the different types of organizations that she was doing some marketing for. And this was all under her own freelance company. Okay, so if you are someone who has done a lot of different gig type opportunities, or you have some freelance work you're doing, that is a way to list that. Okay. We talked before about how it's sent and to whom matters. So if you're emailing a resume, I do usually encourage people to convert it to a PDF document, and then to make the name easy to read. So if I were sending my resume to a marketing position, I would say J. Lombardo, marketing specialist resume. So that way they know who I am, what the general gist of my resume is about, through the name of that document. And I would convert it to a PDF so that it doesn't kind of the format go off, off the charts when I send it along. For applicant tracking system, the focus there is on keywords. And what you really want to think about in those resumes is a synthesis between what they are seeking and what you have to offer. So you're kind of doing a comparison between a job description. If it's an opening, that makes it real easy. If there's an opening and they're using the language already, make sure you're synthesizing that to emphasize in your resume. Those words should also be repeated. There's some algorithms that say that for every one of the major keywords that is in a job posting, you should mention it 3 times in your resume somewhere. I personally think that if you hit the topic 1 time, that's sufficient. But there are certain algorithms that different artificial intelligence or AI systems use. And so those keywords are really important. If you are doing a resume for an ATS system, you have to keep it very simple. This is why I always go to a simple format in terms of layout and formatting. If you're sending it to an applicant tracking system, the best format is Word or plain text, or you can ask wherever you're applying the best format that they prefer, and they will tell you. In some ATS systems, they cannot read a PDF, and so they won't let you upload a PDF document. And then the third thing is, don't just send it out with any follow-up. A lot of times when job seekers don't hear back after they send their resume out, it's because they've not followed up. And make sure you follow the instructions of how to send it, and when possible, send it attention to a person within the organization, not just to whom it may concern or just a general inquiry. So I do think that, really connecting with someone is important. The more referrals you can get, the better. So if someone refers you to apply to a job, I think that definitely does have some traction where you can get that interview no matter what. I wanted to share, one second, I'm just gonna close out of here. And I'm gonna pull up some sample resumes that I have to show. Okay, here's an example of a reverse chronological resume. You know, if I were critiquing this particular resume, I would probably say you don't need the full address in here. Notice they have a website that's listed, and they also have sort of a position title sort of catch at the top. This is not necessary, but you can do something like that. They start right out with their work experience at the top. This particular, someone asked me about how do you get it to fit to 2 pages, maximizing the format. I don't love this format for the reason of it takes up a quarter of the page with white space. So if I were critiquing this, I would take this information, put it underneath each category heading and be able to use across the page. So with some different format tricks, like setting your narrow margins, like a 0.5 all the way around, using a smaller font, I would stick to about a size 11 font. Because again, it's hard to read on a screen, and so you can't go super small. I would say that this font is, a little bit small. And then you want to go with maybe just fonts that are easy to read. Calibri, Times New Roman, Arial, those are pretty standard. And let me go down so you can see the rest. This person also has a skills section on their resume. Again, it's those hard skills. Some projects, maybe this is some freelance stuff they've been doing on their own, and then their education is the bottom, okay? And they have dates tied to their education. Like I said, if it's been more than 10 plus years, you can take the date off. That would be fine if you're worried about that. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to share another sample. Show you a different one. The other type of sample, not as common, but can work for some people. This is a functional resume. And what I like about this one is this is really good for someone who might be changing careers. So if they have no direct related work experience, they're listing their work experience at the bottom, and they are highlighting their skills sort of generally. So all this project management experience and relationship management come from all 3 of these positions that are listed at the bottom. I will say this type of resume is not as preferred by employers, but in some cases can work better for some job seekers, especially if you feel like you have no related experience whatsoever and your skills are very transferable, but you really have to work hard to make sure that the employer knows that those skills are transferable. I would say in some cases, that's where the functional one does come in handy. Personally, if I were gonna really recommend it would be a hybrid of the 2. And so, for example, under Corporation Central, Boulder, Colorado, if they're a business operations manager, I would probably break up their skill sets among certain themes. So underneath that, have the term project management, relationship management, and then highlight those bullet points underneath that. And do the same thing for the others, maybe trying to use as many transferable skills as themes as possible. Because I do think employers like to see what you did at what job. I do think that they like to see that connectivity. And then the last one, and I know we're over time, but I'll just have a couple more points. Because I wanted to show you that there are certainly contemporary practices around these types of resumes that are somewhat more creative. So this is an infographic resume. As you can see, this is relevant to the industry. So this person is a designer in design, and they have used, in this case, I would say a template works unless you have like really good Photoshop or Illustrator experience and you can just create something very clever. But they're doing it very differently. And even in this case, you'll see some interest at the bottom. I don't always love the interest on there. Most employers will tell you that unless it's relevant interest, they don't really care. But every once in a while, you get the person who really likes to kind of learn, what this person likes to do. It makes you more human qualities than versus just what you've been doing. So again, it's about the industry. It's about who's reading your resume and understanding. If you were an accountant telling me you would do this kind of resume, I would say no way. If you were in banking finance telling me this, I would say no way. But if you were an art teacher, if you were in marketing or visually creative fields, I would tell you, yes, go for it because you have room to do that. If you're going to upload that into an ATS system, I would say that will fail miserably. So you might want to create a creative resume and an ATS type resume, something that's very basic and straightforward. Because ATS systems can't read this kind of stuff. Not to mention this is an image. It's like a JPEG. So it's not an actual document that can be interpreted. All right, let me go look. I got a question here. How far back should you include or eliminate awards in your resume? Good question. I think it depends on the award. You know, if it's like a really prestigious award that's like a one-time in your career type of award, I say go for it, include it. But if it's kind of a, or the other thing is if you got an award through a job you had and you're listing that job still, then you could include it underneath that job. But I think you really have to ask yourself, is this an exceptional award that merits being on there? Will it really separate me from the pack? Or is it just something that I personally have a lot of pride in? And is that something I could just take off in this case? So it depends on the relevancy. You know, I think anytime you go back more than 10 years in an award, it feels kind of dated. But again, if it were a once in your career type of award, a special distinction, you know, like if I were to receive the Chancellor's Award for Service at Geneseo, I would always keep that on my resume because that is a once in your career type of distinction that I would be proud of if I were staying in higher education. If it was an award that I got just for my, you know, event that I did a couple years ago, you know, after a few years, I would say that runs its course. Okay. All right. And then let me just show one more thing here. Okay, another question. If you're a double major minor and you don't use one of the major minors professionally, is it still something that should be included? Is it dishonest to exclude this education section? It's not dishonest because again, it's about relevancy. So, and this goes for education, it goes for, you know, jobs, even if you had a job in there for a little bit of time and it was a short stint. If it's not relevant, you could get rid of it. If it helped you to, if it's something you're going to talk about in an interview. So for example, say you did a, you know, I was a double major undergrad in biology and psychology. Obviously I didn't use my biology, but in some cases it comes in handy for me because I you know, help as a pre-med advisor at the college. So I tend to keep it on my resume in some cases because even though I don't directly use that degree, it helps me in terms of a skill set I have and an industry understanding. I understand the STEM industry a little bit better than maybe somebody who didn't have that background. So it really depends on, is it truly irrelevant or do you pull skills from it? And does it make you seem like an interesting person? So maybe you studied African history. Does that allow you to better understand a culturally diverse population than if you did not study that? So I think you just have to think about, do you truly not use it and is it irrelevant? Or does it make you seem more of an interesting, well-rounded person? You know, because I could see either way. And then the last thing that I'll say, I gotta find my PowerPoint again. I'm missing the double screen of my work computer. Usually I'm working from the office. Let's go back to this very last slide and make sure there's nothing I didn't forget here. Okay. So my last point, other tips, we talked about font, we talked about format, you know, bolding can help, consistency. So if you're bolding all of your organization names, continue to bold those organization names throughout your entire resume. Use of space. I just critiqued a resume today and the person sent it over and it was jammed onto one page and there was no spacing between anything on the entire resume. I would rather see you go onto 2 pages and space things out or get rid of things that aren't as important, because you need to have spacing on there. Because if you can't get through it easily the first time through, it's really hard. You have to have some space in there. And some of the formats, like I mentioned with the samples, you know, where a quarter of the space is white page, or if your margins are too far in, you know, you really have to just think creatively about how to maximize the space on the page. When appropriate, provide examples of your work. You know, in some cases, if you can include live links on a resume, it's not always applicable, but in some cases you can. So if you have a website, for example, with projects listed on there, or you have an example, I keep going back to the Etsy question. If you have an Etsy site where you want to promote your work that you're doing because it's relevant to what you're applying for, what you want to break into, list it, link it right into your resume. If you know you're sending hard copy, you can include those live links when appropriate. I have lots of people ask me about photos. I never get too personal on a resume, and I do not recommend photos on a resume. You'll have a professional photo on your LinkedIn if you have a LinkedIn or other sites, but really on a resume, it's not an appropriate place for a photo unless it's relevant to your position. Like if you're in acting or theater or somewhere where your physical appearance is used for qualifications. But otherwise, your physical appearance really should not matter in your ability to do a job. Okay, so there's just some last thoughts I had. And then, you know, I do have our website listed here because we have on the career development website a number of resources for alumni as well. So depending on where you are in your career, we have a whole slew of online resources. We have something called Career Shift, which you can search for positions in a variety of industries. We have, you know, the Alumni Career Advisor Network, where if you're on that as an advisor or interested in, you know, looking for career advice from your fellow alums, that's a great place to check out because we built that specifically for alumni to help other alums and alumni to help current students. So it's a great resource. And we have other resources like Vault, which is a database of gives you lots of information on resumes, job search, and how to set up an appointment. Like I mentioned, during the break would be the perfect time to set up an appointment, and I'm happy to talk with people about their resume. Or if you have quick questions about your resume and you want to email it, happy to answer those. But a full critique is probably going to be looking at the semester break, just because we've been so inundated with students, but always happy to help for sure. And like I said, definitely we'll be sending the slides out. So if you want to go back through, and, you know, I wish we had more time because we could have done more of the reflective element, but those like reflective questions I put in there, please spend some time thinking about those things. They're hard questions. And if you have a couple friends or colleagues that you can work with to help you through those questions, I think that that's really a beneficial process to go through. Any other specific questions? Was this helpful? I know it's late, but I appreciate so many of you staying on here. And, you know, I'm really, you know, I think staying up to date with resumes, it's tough. Like technology changes things so quickly. I think it's really tough to stay up to date. And now with COVID, I think it will change even more quickly. And, you know, I think the world of work is changing so quickly that I can't even begin to predict what resumes might even look like in the next couple of years. I think they will be drastically different. I think we're almost in that place where we might have the conversation about our physical resumes are relevant and has everything gone to an online. I'm not quite there yet. There's still some industries that are hanging on, but I think we're going to be there pretty soon. So I think it will change quite drastically. So if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, definitely invest some time into that. I think it's real important. So, okay. Well, I thank you, and I'm sorry we went over, but I appreciate you all hanging in there. So I hope you have a great night. Feel free to reach out to me with any follow-up questions. Okay, take care.